Um, Barry will talk a little bit, but about almost 3 years ago, he started an Ollie Capitalism Economic Study Group. I think a number of us here are members of both this group and others, and it's really been a
Where's the
fascinating.
volume control?
Pardon? All right, it's been a fascinating tour. So Barry, maybe tell us a little bit about the origins of the study group. I will just say that it was started by Barry and Gary Silberstein, who had two great credentials for this. One is they're both PhD biologists interested in growth and collapse, and they're also amateur investors. And so this was right down their aisle. So Barry, tell us a little bit how you got started and so on, and tell me when to click slides down.
Right. So Gary and I had long been interested in the question of limits to growth. You know, as biologists, we've just always seen this as a major problem that doesn't get enough attention from economists, especially. And among the reading we had been doing, we read a book by a quite eminent German sociologist named Wolfgang Streeck, and the title of the book was "How Will Capitalism End?" It's a rather view from the left, but very interesting. Discussed a lot of complex subjects, and we thought this would really be good to go over this book with a bunch of Oli people, a bunch of interested, smart people, and discuss it. So we started this group called the Future of Capitalism. What we covered in the last almost 3 years is, first of all, just what is capitalism versus what is socialism? How do you really define those? We spent time on the economic history of the US. On the global scale, we've looked at the question of how cultures have collapsed over time and what was the reasons. We've looked at the views of major economists. So on the right, people like Hayek and Friedman, and on the left, people like Keynes and Krugman. And so generally, there are kind of two major problems that we see with capitalism. I mean, one of them is it generates inequality. And it's a huge problem in our time. I want to say just a little bit more about that in a minute. But secondly, it's this biological issue that capitalism depends on growth, unlimited exponential growth. And as biologists, we see that's impossible and that we're coming to a limit much sooner than people are willing to face. So, Pete, if you could just show me that. All right, I just want to talk about this one figure here. What it shows is the population of the world, the global population, over the last 40 years, and what their economic situation is. And if you see in 1981, almost half of the world's population was living at less than $1,000 a year. So one good thing that capitalism has done is this abject poverty proportion has gone down significantly. Although we have to say that the main reason for this is because of the success of China, and the main reason for that is they're selling a lot of stuff to us that we buy. So if we get out to 2015, the end of this chart, what we see is, yes, there has been improvements, but still, all of us participating in this are in the very tippy top of this curve. And we see that more than half of the world's population today is living on an income of less than $2,000 a year, $2,000 a year. And that whole half, these aren't happy sustenance agriculture people. They have televisions. They know what we have. And they want that for themselves, and they want it for their children. And so this is the challenge to capitalism. How can all of this population, most of which still has real needs, meet their needs without completely exhausting the resources of the earth? So I'll return to that, and I'll turn it over to Pete.
Okay, great. So we wanted to share some of what we learned and the rest of that. And being kind of a gearhead, I thought, well, let's turn this into like a real, what are the simplest moving parts of an economic system? And we can look at what's working and not working in each one. So here's the block diagram of an economic system. So on the far left here, you have what is the motivation? And then on the far right, you have, what's the output and the rest of that. And then there's two major requirements. At the bottom, you have to have infrastructure, which in the hunter-gatherer society here would be things like baskets and spears and fire, and also cultural infrastructure, things like customs of who goes out to hunt and whether it's the women or the guys that get the berries and so on. And then you've got the resources, which were then provided by nature, berries, nuts, and rabbits. And so you combine those, I'm hungry, and you combine those resources. They apparently didn't have digital photos back in the hunter-gatherer days, so I had to go back to the 1700s to get a picture of a proper rabbit dinner sitting on a spit there. And then every system has to have some kind of quality control or regulatory mechanism to go, how are we doing? In this case, you might go, we're still hungry, or boy, never eat those red berries because they'll make your stomach hurt. It's the blueberries you ought to be eating. And then you look and if life is good, you stay where you are in this nice fertile area. Hunter-gatherers apparently had a great time, or you move out of Africa and populate the world if you're still hungry. So this is kind of the block diagram of any kind of system. And if we look at capitalism's claims to fame, we could do this for socialism, we could do it for libertarianism. Capital's claims to fame are first that it has the profit motive. This profit motive urges and stimulates people to create things that are really useful and great. And then second, resource allocation is done not by some king or dictator, but it's dispersed to all these owners of capital who have different ideas and different ways to think, but each trying to maximize for themselves the very best. And on a day-to-day basis, they're going to have things like the price mechanism to adjust supply and demand, things like that. So we've got that. And the third thing here is that if we couple this to free and transparent markets where the customer chooses between various competing alternatives, and it's easy for someone to get in and compete, then all the bad suppliers are going to exit, and all the good suppliers will remain. So that's quality control and regulation. And then finally, we build infrastructure. At the end of World War II and throughout the industrial age, we had the world's greatest infrastructure. And we also had what I'm calling cultural infrastructure. We had Yankee ingenuity, and we had this egalitarian idea. We had the American dream, and we had upward mobility. We had people who wanted to work and were willing to work for a wage and put in a hard day's work. And as a result of that, number 6 here, we actually have the world's highest GDP. And if we look at ourselves, pretty good quality of life. Any questions or comments on the world's simplest block diagram? All right, so the idea here is we're going to look at these blocks as we go by and go, so what's working, what's not working, and as we go through here. So if we do some reality checks on the output side, we do in fact have the world's largest gross domestic product. But we're also home to the top 1% that makes 15 times the total wealth of the 15th percentile below, kind of the issue that Gary was talking about. We are home to 6 of the world's 10 largest private banks. The dollar and us dominate the world of finance, and we use that power to create the 2008 financial crisis. Right up before 2008, finance, which is supposed to be like this lubricant, hardly anything, soaked up 40% of the nation's GDP profits.
Could I ask, Barry, could you mute everybody?
Yeah, I should do that. Okay, so Pete, you're probably gonna have to unmute yourself.
All right. All right, you can hear me now?
Yep.
All right. So there are a lot. I mean, Russia is like a world leader in oil, as the Saudi Arabians. But we're the world leader in the oil and gas exploration and refining technology, and we're also the world's #1 climate change denying country. We're the world leader in healthcare spending. We spend about 2x per capita than anybody else, but we have, unlike other countries, many of our citizens not covered, COVID and opioid crises, declining longevity in part because of diabetes and COVID. And if you actually rank us as the WHO and others do, we're about number 18. Now, remember, I'm looking at the efficiency of capital allocations. We obviously have tons of capital, but the GDP isn't making us all wealthy. It's not helping us with climate. You get the drift here. So we're the world leader in defense spending, various, 6 to 7 times, the next bunch of people combined. But if you actually want to look at our batting average, we're about 0 for 5 in major conflicts since World War II. We've wasted trillions, maimed or killed millions, many of them on homeless on our streets, and we're arguably less safe with all the terrorists created along the way. We're home to 10 of the world's 20 best universities. So there's various rankings around here, but you typically have a Harvard at the top, and Stanford might be number 3. And so we've really got a fantastic higher education system. But we're also home to embarrassingly low. PISA ranks kids at 15 on math and science, and we're sitting down like 30 and 20 in various rankings. We have staggering student debt. Unlike Germany, you get a free education. And we did have Trump University, and I'd probably put Liberty University in there too, where if you take a biology course, you apparently learn that the Earth is 6,000 years old and God designed it. Where we have the second largest homes in the world. Now we're beat out here by Australia, but we also have the highest percentage of homeless in the developed world, not counting Germany, which counts all of its immigrants. The people fleeing poverty elsewhere. And we're the inventor of the internet. But when you actually go, well, so how much do we pay to download a gigabyte of data? We pay more than 137 other countries. And if you ask, well, at least we're really fast, and the answer is our average download speed is slower than 87 of them. So the theory of the incredible capital allocation efficiency of capitalism doesn't always turn out in reality, is the point. Thoughts, questions as we move along here? Oh, nobody can do that. Okay. So the bottom line here is I think life is good for us. We're in that richer sort of issue. But we've got some issues. And Barry, maybe if you can unmute us.
Well, anybody can just actually, it turns out I can't unmute people. They have to do it themselves.
So I'm wondering from the group here, just kind of what concerns might be at the top of your list, and you can unmute yourself and maybe mute back again if you wanted to chime in here.
Well, Pete?
Yeah.
One thing is the QC and regulation.
Yeah.
When we were building America, the QC and regulation didn't exist. It was whoever could build the monopoly quickest and eat up all their competitors, and that's what essentially built the nation. That was the railroads, the steel industry, finance, all of those things. And now that we've regulated all that stuff, we're not that isn't a good idea, but we don't have the barons running things anymore. We've got a rather ineffective government.
Let me add a little bit to that. So initially, if you think about the very first big corporation was the East India Company, which was given the equivalent of a corporate charter by the King of England to go rape and pillage the world's resources. And when that hit the U.S., after a while, we got ticked off. The Indians got ticked off eventually, and the rest of that. Early on in the U.S., we gave the land to the railroads. So we had corporate charters for these various people for ports and the rest of that. You're absolutely right that it got out of control, and along comes Teddy Roosevelt and the Trustbusters and the first wave of regulation. And people will argue today that what used to be today's railroads is today's, and then became today's oil companies, which were running the show, and having the military and the things, and now it's today's tech companies, the Googles and the Facebooks. And so if you look at the top 10 wealthiest people in the world, they're not railroad people. They're Facebook, Google, Oracle, Microsoft people. So I'd argue it comes and goes in waves. And you're absolutely right, though, that oftentimes regulation and capitalism become so entwined that it's a very dysfunctional duo. Other comments or thoughts on this? Yeah. I think, was that a question? Yeah, unmute yourself.
Oops, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it just seems very, very clear that measuring our well-being, our well-being can't be measured in value. In other
Big
words,
dollar.
dollars. It can't be measured in dollars. So the big problem is that that's what we do though, as
Yep.
humans. So that's my comment. That's all.
We'll come back to that under motivation a little bit. And I think, does you have a question?
Yeah, I do too, Pete. It seems to me that there's a very strong connection between Wall Street and the US government, and that companies seem to be ruling. They have more than one vote now. I mean, companies are considered people in the United States, and they influence many more groups, than individuals do. So they're much more organized.
I'm with you. And in fact, we're going to go back and look at, why aren't things working well? And that block called QC and regulation is broken because we have a bunch of areas where we have neither customer choice nor effective government regulation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of by design.
And one thing, Pete, going back to my original scenario of
Yeah.
barons, the people that are rich now, the tech people, is because there is no QC and regulation on tech. So that's, so the trend continues, it's just in a different venue.
And the argument early on was that, we want this technology to run as far and fast as it can, so we're the world leaders. That was the argument for not regulating it. And now we're back to, well, maybe Facebook isn't, white hats all the time. So let me
Pete, we just, everyone has opinions on all of this stuff. Could we just hold the questions until the end of your talk?
yeah,
I really appreciate, because otherwise the coherence is lost.
All right. So I've got 4 questions really that I want to address here. One is, why isn't the economy working better for more of us? The second is, why do we have so much partisan gridlock on issues like climate change, healthcare, and financial reform? And I'm going to argue that it's rooted kind of in our economic culture. The second is US style capitalism dragging us to the edge of, Barry and Gary started with this sort of metaphorical Petri dish of, are we approaching the end of it and collapse, and are we headed there? And the second thing is effective regulation even possible? So as we look at some of those kind of things, if you look at, this is the last about 40 years of economic performance in the US, and it's measured by GDP growth. And you see the US at the top here. But every place you see an arrow, you have these little blips. And these blips are things like the savings and loan crisis, the penny stock crisis, the first oil crisis, the second oil crisis, the dot-com boom, the 2008 let's create money crisis, and our response to the pandemic. And in the long term, there's a few things to notice. One is that you'll notice around 1970, we really started taking off, and that was mostly financial wealth. And if you look at the GDP per capita of 63,000, our economy is 70% consumer purchases. So if you took 70% of 63,000, you'd say, around 40,000 ought to be the average per capita income, but it's actually the median. It's actually sitting below 20,000. So in every one of these booms and busts, the rich have been getting a little bit richer, and the rich and the poor a little bit poorer, and so that's kind of one issue that we ought to be mindful of. If we look at this block diagram and ask kind of what's working for us, I'm going to argue, and we'll spend more time on it, that the sole purpose of a corporation is to make profit for shareholders is a very flawed motivation. We'll dig into that. Second, that the typical economic theory started with labor and capital as the two inputs, and it used to be that capital was allocated efficiently. Now it's often allocated to go into the pockets of financial companies. Labor has always kind of struggled, but land was the third thing they talked about it. And today land is things like fisheries, clean air, and the rest of that. We've been misallocating that. And the third area, QC and regulation, as Jim and others have said, we're really pretty dysfunctional there. Our physical infrastructure is aging. In 1950 we had the world's best. Now China beats us in almost everything. And I would argue that the kind of American way, Yankee ingenuity, has given way to kind of a me. So we've got things to fix in each of these bins, And if we're going to improve whatever comes next in the economy, we probably have work to do on each of these little subsystems. So like an appliance that, whoops, the motor's broken, the controls are broken. We need a little fix in each of these. So let me talk a little bit about why motivation might be broken. Just by a show of hands, how many people here know what Maslow's hierarchy is? Yeah, a few do. So if you think about motivation, I'm going to say it's complicated. I've been looking at this for a while. And if you read Freud, it's all about sex. And if you read Skinner, it's all about stimulus and response. And if you read the grit and determination people, it's all about agency. But we have this mix of motivations, and Maslow's idea is that if you're struggling survival, you can't breathe, you're hungry, your motivation is like a hunter-gatherer to eat. If you're threatened, then your motivation is security. So if you're living in a country that you've got drug dealers and stuff, you're going to flee, you're going to you'll do anything you can to do that security motivation. The next level is to belong to some group. Now we're all Ollie members, and so you got a family and the rest of it, and then you get into this higher level, which some of the people we see below here, where you want to have prestige and respect and power and the acknowledgement of your peers and the rest of that. And at the very top is this kind of mystical self-actualization where you find your true self. So what I want to ask this group is, you look at a bunch of people. We got Bezos and Musk and Gates and Skrelly, the guy who raised drug prices 5,000%. And you've got the Koch brother who ran on as president on the Libertarian ticket and spent billions to have his ideas of how things ought to be in hidden money. Or you've got Steyer, who was a hedge fund dude who now wants to save the climate. Which of these guys do you think was motivated from the very beginning by money? Anybody? I don't see anybody. I mean, the answer for all of these people is that there was some other mix of motivations. If you wanted to have a bookseller named Amazon and then have it go on to other things, it wasn't just money. And in fact, Bezos is kind of an interesting guy. He's spending his money going into space, saving the Washington Post from dysfunction, and giving away half his wealth in an amicable divorce so he can sleep next to somebody else and wake up when he wakes up in the morning. and so I mean, who's going to, if money's the motivation, why give half of it away? Musk is a strange guy. He hates free markets and competition, but he wants to save us from AI and electric vehicles, the planet. Gates is giving it, like Buffett and many other 40 other billionaires, giving away half his fortune to worthwhile causes. It's almost like Maslow's hierarchy. You're locked in at the fourth level of trying to ascend and beat your competitors. And then the instant you retire, you want to give it away for some sort of self-actualization. So my whole point on this is that the profit motivation is not necessary to get people to do good things. And furthermore, if we look at a Hewlett and Packard or a Ben and Jerry's or a Larry and Sergey Brin at Google or the Facebook guys, each of these people kind of started with a do no evil kind of approach. Hewlett and Packard just wanted to make a better oscillator. Ben and Jerry's were these like lefty guys who just, wanted to kind of let it hang it out. The Google guys said, we're going to do a different kind of, we had no idea as PhD students what might come of it. They were just curious. And then capitalist guys said, hey, you could start a company. I said, well, okay, but we're not going to do a normal IPO. And they didn't. And by the way, our company motto is going to be do no evil. And then they seem to get captured by, quarterly profit growth and shareholders and new CEOs. And Facebook was basically like, let's have a list of all the really hot girls at Harvard and see where that goes. And similarly in my career, I could give lots and lots of examples of companies that started with one motivation and over time almost were culturally forced to go a different direction. And the bottom line for me on this is that the implicit notion of the profit motive is this notion that if you do good, if you build a railroad, if you go to space, if you build a new company, if you do good, you'll make profits. But profits isn't the goal. It's to be admired. It's all those mix of things.
What difference does it make when you get a big what they want to be admired?
Yeah. Well, here's the difference it makes. That capitalism works if in fact do good is the beginning part of this. but now perhaps 30% of our economy has skipped the do good part. When Goldman Sachs said, there's all this money flowing in, we got to find some way to put it to use. Let's do derivatives. Do good wasn't the motivation. When Shkreli,
But the point is, there's no conflict between wanting to do good and make profits, but to understand what's going on, making the bottom line is very important. In fact, in practice.
You certainly need the bottom line to stay in business. And in fact, once a company reaches break even, customers rather than capitalists provide all the capital. My point is that our economic system, capital, has more and more Enrons and Exxons and BPs and Martin Shkreli's and Health Souths and people who have learned to skip the do good part on way to making profits. And like a Bernie Madoff, they get away with it for a while, and they get admired for a while. But the Enron people were on the Time cover. Bernie Madoff was on the Time cover as being admired, but they were doing it out of.
So was the Leathersburg Homes.
Yes, exactly. So not all of our capitalists are. I'd say it's only about 30% of the economy has this. Let's skip the do good part and go directly to making money. This was, by the way, the theme of the TV show The Apprentice: lie, stab, and cheat in order to get not fired at the end. It really wasn't of producing much good. So motivation is an issue. And if you look at the profit motive, a lot of us pay to play sports, and then you get paid to play. Mothers and fathers often raise their kids better than daycare centers, but they don't get paid for it. The Green Bay Packers are the only team in the NFL that's owned by its customers or its fans, and the rest of the NFL doesn't like that. Wikipedia, no one gets paid for writing for it, yet it's a better encyclopedia than the Britannica. CEO pay, it looks like 10-1 is enough to motivate people to want to, be respected and be at the top of a company. 30-1 in Japan and the rest of the world works fine, but in the U.S. we're approaching 300-1, and we've seen this increasing financial take since 1970 or so. So there's kind of an issue here to be addressed. I just want to point out that it is not that Milton Friedman's sole purpose, profits for shareholder, is not the only motivational structure in the world. Throughout civilization, there are dozens of other possible ways to motivate stuff. So it's not like there's no other choice. And in fact, if you look at the alternatives in this thing, profits first and only is one. But Drucker, I could spend 2 sessions on how you can have a customer-oriented company and aim to produce great stuff. You would think that the purpose of auto company is to make good autos, and the purpose of a spinach company is to make good spinach and the rest of that. Customers first, it can organize a company very well, and in fact does, even at very profitable companies. There's this notion that we really create companies for jobs. I think that's questionable, but workers are certainly a stakeholder. You can combine kind of respect. You need physical resources for the bottom part of Maslow's hierarchy. You don't necessarily need physical resources. Like a scientist are as rewarded by a Nobel Prize as they are, money. The nice thing about a Nobel Prize is you get both. But Barry and Joe, you probably know some Nobel Prize people. I know one guy. I would say if they had a choice between the money or the recognition, they'd probably pick the recognition. What do you think?
Definitely.
Yeah. So we do have alternatives. Is the point here? So let's move to this question of gridlock. Now, I think, Jack, it was you and I that had this discussion, but I've had it with other people. One of the contentions that Barry and Gary had on is that this thrust for perpetual growth was wired in to capitalism, and people push it. No, you don't have to have perpetual growth, and I would say it's not in the definition, but it's in the operation. And let me count the ways. So I'm going to run quickly through all the ways that I think our present economic system depends on perpetual growth. First of all, let's acknowledge that nature's own patterns of population and growth are to grow as fast as you can until something trims you back. So we got tons and tons of turkeys in my backyard, and they're going to be there until the coyotes and somebody else finds them. When inflation is another way of growing, economists love to have a certain amount of inflation because it motivates people to take money out from underneath their mattress and put it into some productive, into a bank, get it lent out into some productive thing. When we abandoned the gold standard in the middle of the Depression, the purpose of that was in order to inflate the money supply so we could stimulate the economy. We give lower capital gains rates rather than income rates to people who would invest their money and build something new. All of our bonds and T-bills, all the time we borrow money or create new money. And we do the same thing in private debt when we get a loan or a mortgage or credit card, or we say, let me spend $50,000 now on loans for tuition because I'll make it back in the future. Fractional reserve, when you put a deposit if you put $1,000 in the bank, they may go out and loan $5,000 to other people, to other businesses and stuff based on that. So that's another way of growth. Our interest rate policy, we've recently started giving money to people. We'll give you money at no percent if you can find anything that's better than no percent to invest in. And in some countries, we actually go, we'll give you money at negative interest percent. Just please go and invest it to save our economy. Quantitative easing is one of the topics. Quantitative easing, if quantitative easing were given to a personal, it would be like, okay, you crashed your car. You're not a very good driver, but we're going to buy your car at the full price of a car and ask you to go buy a new one. Only we do this money to people that have bad debts, major financial institutions, so they can do it. So we've been doing that. Technological progress is kind of like, hey, we're going to keep growing. We're going to go infinitely. The economic pundits, you turn on any of the economic pundits before the 2008 recession, or now it's grow, grow, grow. Dow's going to reach 40,000, et cetera. Modern monetary policy this is beloved of Bernie Sanders and the left. It's the idea that governments can print as much money as they want and give it away, and there won't be any problem as long as we don't get inflation. And so that's kind of how we're running our government now. Company and stock valuations. If you do not grow as a listed Wall Street company, your stock price is going. And we all know lots and lots of, like some of my favorite software is 30 years old, works just fine. But the companies, two of them, database companies, have gone out of existence because they couldn't grow.
Can I ask a question? I have to ask a question. What does population growth have to do with this?
Oh, so
Imagine a case, and I think we have it in Japan. What if the fertility rate is such that the population begins to decline? Then where is growth?
Well, so that's, I think you stated there that the economists want continual population growth in order to pay for Social Security and grow the economy. If you have if you have like 3% population growth of the year, at some point that doesn't work out. Japan, which doesn't have population growth, and Europe, which doesn't have population growth, Japan is now Japan is working on modern monetary policy, borrowing to stimulate the economy. And how long it works, we don't really know. But you're right, population growth is clearly a part of this. Pyramid, Madoff is a clear pyramid scheme. Amway, everybody, I think you're mostly familiar with that. The capital there is provided by people who buy all the stuff and sell it. One of the DeVos, one of the founders of Amway, married a 30-year younger woman, and they spent their billions to help Trump get elected. And then Betsy DeVos, the wife, became Secretary of Education with the goal of privatizing and capitalizing education. And one could even argue in a way that Social Security is sort of a Ponzi scheme too. There's plenty of arguments against it, and I'm not going to spend the time to go both ways, but it does depend on us having future growth and the next generation paying for our Social Security. The short-term orientation and executive compensation of Wall Street is based on growth. You're compensated for growth. We have so much capital chasing investment. In 2008, a lot of people think was caused by the large financial firms saw that there was capital all over the world that wanted to invest someplace, and they didn't have any good ideas for investments. So they said, let's create this thing called mortgage-backed derivatives so we can get all that Arab and European and US money and use that to soak up that money and earn some returns. And of course, that didn't work out well. Today, companies buy back their stock. And when you buy back your stock, two things happen. One is that the returns and the prices go up, but the other is it's an admission that you have no idea of how
Don't
to
the
better.
prices go up?
Pardon?
Do you have evidence the prices go up?
The return.
They buy back?
Yes, yes. If you do share buybacks, the dividend. If you have a given revenue stream, and that revenue stream is now distributed over half the number of shares, your dividends go up by twice, and the price of the stock goes up. So, but the main point I want to make here is that when companies buy back their stock, it's an admission they have no ideas of how to better invest it. They don't have any products to invent. They don't have any R&D. They don't have any new stores to open. It's just, that sort of thing. And there's this thing called special purpose acquisition companies. Here, the capital play is a bunch of people, money says, let's go out and buy a shell company. They got nothing, but they've got a capital structure. And then we're going to look and we're going to look and we're going to look and we're going to find some new company to invest in. And then we're going to merge the two. And it has tax and regulatory advantages when you do that. All of us kind of grew up with cultural expectations of we're going to get better and better, and mass and conspicuous consumption, advertising urging us on. And if you look at the role models, whether it's reality, if you click through the channels, you have all these people who I'm rich and famous, lifestyles and the rich and famous, home shopping network, home gardening network, home foodie network, and now it's on the internet with influencers. So my point about this whole slide is there are so many things that are wired into our culture that says this depends on borrowing against future growth to keep things holding together. You with me on that? Any questions or thoughts?
Well, I've got one little question about your chart there.
Yeah.
The GDP per capita, that sort of implies that the GDP is distributed across everybody there. Like India's got a very low GDP per capita, but that's because they've got a lot of people. Same with China.
Yeah.
But that capital isn't distributed evenly. Well, actually, it's probably true with all of these. But I guess what I'm saying is that the per capita is it is sort of a strange way to represent that.
I agree. Yeah, so that's a good point, Jim. And as we kind of hit it before, the USA of all the companies listed there is probably the most unequal. China's interesting too because it has a bunch of billionaires. If you look at that chart, we took off after World War. I found several charts. This is the one that showed up best, but where it shows the break really ought to be after post World War II rather than after. It looks like kind of the middle of World War II that they counted war production, but it was all debt at that point. So we've gone up, but notice the kink. Many economists believe we are now on, in part because of this headed towards the edge of the Petri dish, since about 2000 on a lower growth regime. So whether that happens or not, remains to be seen.
Except for China.
Yeah, well, and even China is now slowing growth, but China's had fantastic growth. They've also had fantastic investment over this period. So
China cannot grow significantly if we in Europe do not buy their goods. Yeah. And the demographics are such that they have a very shrinking consumer class. So they have no magic way out of this.
Yeah, we won't go into it here, but one of the sessions in Barry and Gary's group was looking at China. And there's a guy named Zihan who thinks it's going to all crash and tumble, and there's others that think it's going to go on and dominate the world, and our kids will find out. All right, so along with growth, then comes this insatiable appetite for. If you're going to grow, you need resources, and so if you look at the history of our economic system, we put men to work. We put them to work for 60, 70 hours a week. Then we regulate it back. We put children to work, and people said, no, you can't do that unless you're in China. Then we said, hey, wait a second, these women aren't working. Let's put them to work, and maybe we can get them to work for like 30 or 40% less. And then the work week, if you're at a high achieving company, is now back to 70, 80 hours a week. And now we're discovering machines, robots, and AI can just work kind of like three shifts a day. Energy, we're digging and drilling deeper and deeper. Oceans, we're fishing to some species to collapse. Forests, we're clearing for timber and agriculture. You've got Jared Diamond on collapse as one possible way that works out. You've got the conflict in the Brazil Amazon rainforest is another. Barry can talk about how we're, whether it's water or clean air or soil or sand or phosphates, we're beginning to see price rises and problems there. And media has this insatiable desire to have us click on stuff and spend hours a day in front of it. So the net effect of this is that if in fact we have free markets as a regulatory mechanism, capitalism is still working pretty good. So if you look at the price of food, it's plummeted. Now the quality may not be what you want, but the price is there. Consumer packaged goods, the stuff that you can buy from PG, Procter and Gamble, pretty cheap. And there's the generics out there. Housing in rural areas, reasonably affordable. Computing, we've got Moore's law. It's getting cheaper and cheaper. Consumer electronics. Now capitalists go, we can't make enough money here, so let's ship them abroad. But you can buy a big screen TV for a tiny fraction of what it was before. Same thing with appliances. Cars and trucks cost about the same, inflation adjusted over the years, but they've got so much more content in them, computers and stuff. Air travel plummeted when we deregulated. Cataract surgery is one of the medical things that has real competition and done this. So we have a bunch of areas of our economy that there is in fact competition. It does keep prices lower. And if you walk into a Costco, it's filled with stuff that pretty much has competition, and we benefit every time we walk into Costco or a Walmart if you can get by the fat people to by the lower prices. But we also have a number of areas where I'm calling them rig markets, but there's been regulatory capture and no real sense of customers in charge. So the healthcare costs have dramatically outpaced the cost of living. And if you look at that, if I'm near death and dying, I do not negotiate with the ambulance driver about which hospital and doctor treats me. If as I did, I had cancer treatment, I look around a bit, and I try to find a good provider, but I can't really negotiate the price of drugs and things and so on my own. So there is no real consumer choice in the really expensive stuff of healthcare. You can get it, for cataract surgery and stuff like that. And these companies are very good at, like the pharma company says, every other country can negotiate drug prices, but we can't. You have to let us charge what we can get, and so on. So healthcare is one of these areas where we don't have good regulatory mechanisms. And guess what? We had gridlock on reform. The military spend. Eisenhower warned us about the military industrial complex. We spent trillions and trillions of dollars in Vietnam and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and in covert actions in South America. And we basically have nothing to show for it. I mean, it's like one of the worst returns on investment we've got. And, about the closest thing that I've had throughout that entire process. I mean, I haven't really voted on wars and the rest of that. All you could do is say, I think I'm going to go to Canada instead of, go to the Vietnam War. Very limited consumer choice. School tuition is also rising far faster than inflation. And in part, that's due to a mix of throwing money at it with scholarships. That's kind of a government issue. And schools pretty much charging what the price will bear. Finance has taken this larger and larger and larger piece off the top. We had like one of the major pieces of Depression era legislation was Glass-Steagall, which said we're going to separate the really risky financial stuff from ordinary banking. And so if you're just doing ordinary banking, you can predict gradual increases. You can buy a home, you can start a small business, but this derivative stuff will be separate. The finance then talked to everybody, including Clinton, that we don't need regulation. Who would be so crazy as to have a 2008 crash? No finance companies would take those risks. And then we had the crash, and then we promised regulation in both political platforms. So Donald Trump's platform said reinstate Glass-Steagall, and the Elizabeth Warren's on the Democrats said we're going to redo regulation. And by and large, we've done like a tiny fraction of that. Housing in cities is rising far faster in cost than inflation, in part because there's limited land, in part because there's regulation. And at any tech or media with rising network, so your Comcast or whatever, you start seeing rising bills. So does anybody remember when cable TV cost like $10 a month? And is anybody spending less than, like 200 a month now? So my point here is that if you want to look at the politically contentious areas where we seem to have gridlock, where Congress can't do anything, it's places where we're sucking tons and tons of trillions of dollars of money out of that industry, and that money is coming back into the regulatory process in the form of hidden money and campaign donations and attack ads and studies that show global warming's not real, and opioids don't really hurt you, and so on and so forth. Point made. Any comments or thoughts? Okay. I don't really have the answer to this, but it also strikes me that we have more profits in moving stuff around. We would think that just moving stuff from point A to point B would be kind of cheap, kind of like, getting a truck driver to move it from there. But from the beginnings of the Silk Road to empires and voyages of discovery, opening of the route to China, was kind of a Columbus and a Magellan deal. The East India Oil Company that had us in a revolution. The British were so eager to have tea trade with China, they went to war to force them to have an opium market. We did the same with Perry in Japan. We did the same in the banana republics. World trade is kind of people going, why don't everybody like world trade? And of course, China's doing this very, very effectively now in its Belt Trade Initiative. They're making poor countries deals they can't refuse, and as to get access to the resources. There's been a ton of technology developed along the way: clipper ships, container ships, internet, interstate highways, drones, etc., to move stuff. And some of our wealthiest companies. So it used to be just great to own the granary rather than to grow the grain. It was great to be a liquor distributor. Maybe the mafia liked it too. Drug dealers have great things, supply chains, media rights, the Walmart. So there's a lot of money here. Maybe it's a topic for future discussion for us. Just strikes me as there's a little bit of a, you own the distribution channel, and then you can jack up prices going on there. So the point here is that whether you take relatively innocuous people on the right, like the hedge fund dude Mitch Romney, or that sweet grandmother Hillary Clinton, who took $400,000 to give a single day's talk to Goldman Sachs about how nice she was going to be to them, or whether it's the dark money and the Citizens United and the really perverse things going here, we have got a lot of capital contributing to our regulatory gridlock. And if we don't do things to overturn that, and by the way, there's simple things, like Bullock's idea of just disclosing this stuff to solve that, we're not going to get out of it. And Democrats aren't moving on it any more than the Republicans are, even though they're currently the most egregious on this. Thoughts or comments? Okay. So allocation of resources. So are we efficient? Are we doing well? So the economic theory is that the profit motive means smart decisions and people, plants, and equipment based on expected return. Now, these capitalists aren't stupid people. They're gonna just find the best people, get the best equipment, so on. Competition in free and transparent markets is going to regulate things. Rather than have a Stalin or a Xi or a Mao decide we're going to do a steel industry, our own steel industry is going to make much better decisions. We'll get these smart investments in people and plants, and the price mechanism, rather than central control of Stalin, you will make so many tons of steel, will adjust supply and demand. And there are some areas that works in, and that's the theory. And in fact, the theory at one point it was so strongly felt that capital in the capitalist market was so efficiently invested, it didn't matter what you invested in. And in fact, economists, this is a fairly recent thing, but this chart is GDP growth plotted against national savings. So the logic here is that if a company puts its money in a bank and the bank lends out the money, it goes to new investment. So it goes to flower shops and distributors and steel makers and agricultural purposes, that the higher the savings rate, AKA investment rate, the higher the GDP. And you see that now China, way up at the top right there, is way off the charts. They are getting far more GDP growth, but they also have an incredibly high savings rate. and you go to like poor countries at the bottom here, low savings rate, low growth. The U.S. is kind of buried there at around when this was done at about a 15% savings rate and slightly lower than average return. But the basic logic here was is it doesn't matter where you invest because all the decisions are so smart. But then we started getting bridges to nowhere and mortgage-backed derivatives and failure to invest in flint water pipes, along with good things like deciding to sequence the genome. It really does matter now, in part because of all the games that are playing, whether you invest intelligently. And this is a question facing our Congress right now. Where do we invest in infrastructure? Who do we give money to? Those are the issues. So we have to ask ourselves, are we getting the highest uses? I've got maybe two examples here. This is a picture of a Niagara Falls generator project a little after 1950 that has produced cheap power ever since. It was actually the largest publicly funded electric power generation company in the world at its time. And then we have all the garbage we ship to Indonesia, China, and stuff like that, and wondering if that's the best use of these kids' labor and the land and stuff. And Barry is kind of the expert on this. Before we get to him, I'll just say we do face kind of a modern monetary paradox now. We likely now have more capital than we have good ideas for investment. We are awash in capital. You know, that 0.01% that might be the Waltons and the Rockefellers and the rest has so much money, and the Saudi Arabians and their wealthy European contracts has so much money that we say put it any place in 2008. We have those stock buybacks I talked before. We don't know how to spend the money, so let's just buy back our stock. And we have all these new hidden and private equity markets or SPACs and stuff, just looking for some place to invest. Right now, a lot of us would kill for a bank account that would give us 2% interest. And that's just saying we don't have very many good ideas of where to put this capital. But while we have ample capital, we have clearly finite natural resources. In the edge of the Petri dish, it's just a few resources. It's sugar and oxygen and the rest. Here, we're dependent on everything from predictable climate and fertile soil and enough of the right kind of sand for concrete and clean water and friendly inhabitants of oil-rich companies and empathy and truth and trust in institution and bees and rare earth materials that any shortage can slow growth. And we also, as a complex society, another thing we study, need to have fragility that's not always seen. COVID-19 should have been a pretty simple test. I mean, it isn't the most compared to the 1918 flu, not particularly deadly, and yet here we are, running with our heads chopped off with the kind of flu we can expect to have more virulent versions of the future. And the point that was an aha for me is that every time we manufacture or print or quantitatively ease a new dollar, that dollar is a call on resources. By call, I mean it says, okay, here's your $100,000 loan, and in return, you're going to build something in concrete or want rare earths, or even if you mine Bitcoin, you're going to be using energy that every new dollar require comes along with it of a call, a demand for some more of our resources. And Barry studied an awful lot of this question of resource allocation, and I'll let you kind of take over, Barry.
Okay, so in capitalism in the last few years, we do have a kind of spectrum of belief, and I think Pete is really focused on the question of, can capitalism be fixed? If we regulated it better, would it be a better capitalism? And I think, yes, it would be. I think I've probably been a little bit more of the lefty, the more pessimistic side, in that I think even a well-functioning capitalism still faces these fundamental problems that we must face. And basically that growth of the human population is limited by resources. So this is the analogy of the Petri dish. The Petri dish thereby, by the way, is filled with neurospora, which is the organism that I study. And if you put one tiny invisible spore in the center of that dish, in 24 hours, it's grown completely across the surface. And in about 3 days, it will have reached the edge. The stuff in the middle is starting to die, and the whole plate will die in a few days. Now, if you look at modern populations of, say, wolves or lynx, they don't have such a closed system. It's conceivable that they can reach a sustainable population, but there is a max. There's a max that they just can't go by because they're limited by their food and resources. And what you find in the real world is that often they'll overshoot their resources. The population will collapse. Sometimes it'll recover and sometimes it won't. The challenge for us as humans is that we are capable of growing over the entire petri dish for us. If you could move on to the next slide, Peter. Just a couple of pictures are always better than than words. This is what's happening in large parts of the world. So here's a city in Mauritania. You go back 100 years, there were nomadic herders here, and this was just kind of an empty space. But the growth has covered the desert, and the desert is encroaching on the town. And it's worse than it looks, because what we see here is where the haves, the people who have money, live. On the other side of the track, literally, on the left side bottom corner, this is where all the squatters live. So this is the challenge for humans, that we've occupied all of the arable space, and we're having to live on these spaces that are just not going to support us. So if you go to the next one, Peter. I love this slide because where is this? It looks like Scandinavia or something. This is China. This is what the people who have money in China are doing. They're building Western style houses, and they are completely occupying every square inch that's occupiable. The fields are now highly capital intensive, resource intensive, plastic, steel bars to make all those things, intensive agriculture, irrigation. There's a limit to this. All right, so next. So what I see as a biologist is that, two things happen. We have to have food, air, water. We have to have them. All right, and secondly, we have to avoid generating toxic waste. That's the other key part of it. And that's where our challenge is now. Our principal toxic waste is carbon dioxide and methane. And our principal other toxic challenge is what we've done to our water. After all, there are very few rivers in the entire globe that run to the sea that are not significantly polluted. Even though we've made improvements, they're all significant sources of toxins. And as far as the food challenges, those are obvious. We're just seeing the depletion of arable land, depletion of fisheries. One of the things I think just does not get nearly attention that it should, is we are just losing the dirt, the soil. Some of the richest farmlands in the world are in the Great Plains and the Midwest. Iowa has lost like 20, 30 feet of the topsoil that was there 100 years ago. And some of the projections are that with more storms, et cetera, we could lose all of the topsoil within less than 100 years. And these are problems that are not fixable in a human lifetime. If we get saltwater intrusion, if we lose the topsoil, they are just not easily remedied. And beyond this, of course, there are all these resources that we as humans use that animals don't, like minerals and metals and rare earths and fertilizer. There's a lot of phosphate and potassium out there, but there's less and less cheap phosphate and less cheap potassium that we have to grow our food. So beyond this, we don't know the tipping points. It isn't necessarily an inevitable slow decline. Ocean acidification is one of them. At some point, you push the pH to something that you have a massive die-off, and that has huge consequences. At some point, you melt the tundra and you release the methane. Massive consequences. At some point, you change the direction of the Gulf Stream. They're now seeing the first indication that would convert Europe into something. After all, you know, London is at the latitude of Hudson Bay. If you lose the Gulf Stream, which warms all of Europe, massive consequences. So there are some big organizations, some big academic institutions that are trying to really look at how close to the edge of the petri dish are we really? What is our biological capacity on the planet and how much of it are we using? Let me show you just one slide from this organization. This is the Global Footprint Network, and they do global studies. Let me go to the next one, Pete. So what the center dashed line there is their calculation of what's the biocapacity of the earth. So going from the bottom of their list, you need a certain amount of grazing land, you need some forest, you need land to put your houses and factories on, you need your cropland, you need fishing. And the carbon that's the measure of toxic waste. So their estimate is that we crossed this threshold, we exceeded the biocapacity of the earth in 1970. Now, much of that today, the excess is that we're producing CO2 at a far greater rate than the earth is able to absorb it. And so we have this toxin buildup. But all the other things, you see cropland, et cetera, we are approaching the total capacity. We're a little ways off from it, but not that far off. And what's going on in addition to, you know, these kinds of studies, what really helps us nowadays is we have these Earth orbiting satellites. So it gives us the capacity to look at the whole Earth and to really measure quite precisely the human impacts. And some of these studies estimate that right now humans are using something like 25% of the primary productivity, that is the energy from the sun. We are using it 25%. We can't use 100%. We have to leave something for the rest of the world, or everything else will go extinct. And that has massive consequences too. So I think is there another one, Pete? What's the next slide? Okay, all right. So I'm gonna leave it there. The point being that all these other problems really, even if solved, are secondary to this one. There are limits and we're approaching them. In fact, we are probably beyond them today. Pete?
All right, thanks. So let me just recap. So we've been in that little subsystem called resources, and asking about effective allocation. And I think the summary would be that there are three major kinds of resources to allocate. One is capital, one is labor, and one is land, which also includes fish and oil and rare earths and the right kind of sand for concrete and stuff like that. And historically, capitalism has done a good job of allocating capital, much better, say, than communism under the Soviet thing. That's part of the reason it collapsed. It's today doing a poorer job of capital allocation, witness the 2008 and the stock buybacks, the SPACs, and money hunting for good places to find it. Capitalism has always tried to allocate the lowest possible wages to labor, but through time, those of us with a good education have certainly gotten our share, and it is pretty much always tried to not pay for the land and the resources it used. And we got away from that when we had huge stocks of land and resources, but maybe not for the future. So let's talk about effective regulation to try to fix some of that stuff. So you can't really see the things here, but in this block of quality control and regulation, the little thing above there is a Watts governor. And in the early ages of coal and the early industrial age of steam engines had a nasty habit of overheating. And boom and bust them was it would get hotter and hotter, and it would literally explode. And that wasn't good for the people around it or the industry or anything like that. And Watts came up with the idea of this governor, which just regulated. It got to a steady state on the logistic curve that Barry showed. It kind of kept things right below carrying capacity of the steam engine in that case. And so I want us to think of governance not just as an evil government or this or that, but just what are the mechanisms we have to keep this thing from blowing up? And we clearly have boom and bust every bunch of years and stuff like that. As we said before, there's a lot that's broken to this. I think you could divide the regulatory mechanisms to four things. One is competitive markets, and I do think that one of the geniuses of capitalism is that when you do have free and transparent markets with customers in charge, that works pretty well. Now, we have a whole bunch of markets that aren't free and transparent, that have too big to fail companies, but I think that's a piece that really works. You also have a regulatory mechanism for truly smaller family business, because there, the person who is the capitalist is also the floor sweeper and the vacation taker and the child care minder and the rest of that. And that very small businesses can literally balance for themselves the various requirements of business. And for many, for centuries, religions, morality, reciprocal altruism try to do it. It's interesting if you look at major religions, they went from thou shalt not charge interest. The chance of a rich man entering heaven are worse than a camel going through an eye of needle, to kind of here's how you get rich if you're part of my church. So that's another regulatory set of things. Then we have sort of government. In a lot of countries are ruled by strongmen, threats of violence. This is great for if you're part of the inner group, and if not, and if you don't go along, we'll kill you. We have rule of law in more civilized countries, rules that are, if you look at the Supreme Court, that are now subject to other pressures. We have tax policy, we have monetary policy, and we have regulation, whether it's zoning regulation locally, food, drug, the environment, workplace safety. And then finally, the environment itself, just as it does for a Petri dish, kind of regulates us. So we probably have 16 horsemen of the apocalypse now, rather than the original 4. So those are our choices, and I think, Barry, you've got a few more points to add on this.
Well, just the other thing that we talked about quite a bit in capitalism was in terms of regulatory mechanisms. One of the best regulators, of course, is the tax system, and it's a way to directly address the inequality issue. So I just want to show 2 real take-homes from all of that analysis. One is that if we look at what has happened, in the past 50 years, you see from the kind of 1960s through the mid 80s, looking at the bottom, the orange curve there, the top 1% of people in the US made about 12% of the income. And there was a little dip, but, it was within a range of, from 11 to 13%. And the bottom 50%, the poor people in the country, made about 20% of the income. But then somewhere in the mid 80s, that changed dramatically. And that is the poor people in the country, who were making about 20% of all the money, lost nearly half of that, or at least it lost 70% of that. And where did it go? It went in a major way into the top 1%. So the inequality has become pretty extreme. And the second one, you could adjust this by taxes, but that's just not what happened. The next slide, Pete.
Yeah.
So we spent some time with a book written by Emmanuel Sayes and Zucker. These are both economists at UC Berkeley who've really done a lot of investigating into taxes, tax structure, et cetera. And this one graph here is rather interesting. It shows the tax rate by income group. So you see on the left side there is the tax rate. So 25% of income is paid to taxes by almost everybody in the US. Now you may think, wait, these people aren't paying any income tax, they're paying nothing. But this is all taxes. This is sales tax. This is when you take a hotel room and there's an occupancy tax. It's your utility bill tax, your property tax. If you figure all taxes, our tax structure is not progressive really at all. The people who in the bottom 50% of the population, in fact, are paying slightly more taxes than the various wealthy people in the country. So this means of regulation is one of the best ways we could make a more respectful capitalism, and it's just not happening. The other thing is just that, the other way to regulate that we've talked about is that we can try to make markets be fair to suppress monopoly power and to somehow admit that there are certain things that just don't respond well to the market mechanism, and that's education, healthcare, and to some extent, the minimum of food and housing security. So let me say that this is my last bit for the talk here. It's just that my view is the challenge for capitalism is that we are very soon going to be living in a world of scarcity, and that capitalism is going to have to fundamentally change. We're going to have to change things that we love, like private property. We're going to have to change the idea that markets are the best way to distribute resources. I think we're going to have to, in a world of scarcity, have some form of rationing. I mean, who gets to visit the national parks? You can't let everybody in that wants to be in. You've got to ration it some way. Basically, have we ever done this successfully? Well, I think capitalism is going to have to be replaced by something like a wartime economy. And if people are really faced with an existential threat, I think they can still live a decent life. So that will be the end of my contribution. Back to you, Pete.
So a couple points while we're on these slides. One is that if you look at by country overall taxation at all levels, the U.S. is sitting at about 35% of GDP, a little bit less, goes into taxes at every level. A country like Denmark is at about 50%. So when people argue that we have too much taxes here, you have to go compared to what? About the only first world country with lower tax rates that we have is Ireland pre-Brexit. And that's because they have no defense and have been basically relying on the UK for a lot of resources and made it an explicit policy to try to attack corporate tax havens and stuff like that, something that the rest of Europe may not let them get away with there. So we don't, our taxation rate, the question with our taxes is, are we using them efficiently? And I'd say probably not in all cases. In fact, surely not in all cases. Not maybe that we're paying too much. The other thing I'd point, maybe kind of going back to Barry's previous slide here, is that right now we're debating whether to more heavily tax incomes. And as we discussed, even in the most recent capitalism group, it's easy to get around the income thing. We probably ought to be taxing wealth. And the conclusion I've come to is that an estate tax is probably, in terms of motivations, the rest, the fairest and most effective way of doing that. So you don't want to tax a Hilton when he's building the Hilton empire. But once he's got, $10 billion of value, do you want to give all that money to Paris Hilton so she can strip and make famous videos? Or do you want to let Paris have just a mere billion and divide the other 9 billion into 9,000 $1 million small business startup funds for Stanford and Harvard grads? And I would say that giving people with good prospects of ideas of how do we cure cancer, how do we increase our food supply might be the better way. So just
I have a question.
Pardon?
I have a question.
Yeah.
And it goes to Barry. Why do you think we have to abandon private property and markets? Because we already live in a world of scarcity. I don't understand why you think things are more scarce. We have to abandon these arrangements rather than perfect them.
Well, I think one example of the reason why I think that it's just in our face is just who can afford a place to live in Santa Cruz. I mean, Santa Cruz housing is based on a market mechanism, and it's gone totally berserk.
It's
A
also,
median home cost well over $1 million, and a professor can't afford to live here.
but that's not the issue. We have also rules about single-family housing and zoning. If the rules were changed, we have to have denser housing here. Of course, we're limited by water supply.
If I might interject, in the capitalism group, one of the nice things is it's kind of like Brooks and Shields or Brooks and Capehart. We have a spectrum of opinion. So I'm a little bit more to Barry of respectful, like Brooks and Capehart and Brooks and Shields. Of we keep markets, we keep private housing, but we solve the problem. So we've got this whole spectrum there. I'd also note that I just saw in the Economist that California has just passed a law that says every single family housing can be split up into 4 separate dwelling units. I haven't come up to speed on this, but if so, that means that everybody who owns a house in Santa Cruz can turn it into up to 4 units. So maybe that's a regulatory answer to a small piece of the problem. Don't know. I think, Jack, the answer is we're still trying to figure our way out here. And if we collapse, we're certainly going to get a new economic system. And if we avoid collapse, we'll probably keep some of the pieces that we had and make them work for us in the future. Okay.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I think that the collapse is likely to come piecemeal.
Yeah.
It's happening already to a number of other people. The people who live along the Sahel, the people who live in Syria, the people who live in the Western Highlands of Guatemala are already experiencing collapse because of climate change and various other things. And we who have great financial resources are basically just trying to keep them from getting in the gates. I think that it can go a long way like that before we are forced to make stark choices ourselves.
I think that's right.
And I also think that capitalism is poorly suited to exerting or to using foresight. We can see that there are likely going to be not just bumping into the limits of the capacity of the Earth, but actually decreases in the capacity of Earth to support people, because we're mining water in various places where we grow a lot of crops, and once it's mined and gone, we're going to stop growing crops there. So it's, but I'm not sure that we're going to be able to fix that just by abandoning capitalism. There are an awful lot of things that we have to do. The capacity of capitalism to, take account of third-party effects and things like that is very poor as well. And so the damage that we're doing doesn't show up in the balance sheet.
Good points.
Yeah, I'd echo that. There are so many flaws in capitalism that I think we're stuck having to turn the problem upside down and think much more like Barry than like capitalists. One problem with capitalism politically is regulatory capture. Who's regulating who for what? And there are enough lobbyists to undermine almost any regulation you want to put in, if people that have money really are determined to keep it. I'll give you a couple of examples right now. One is Cuba and healthcare. The Cubans spend 8% per capita of what we do on healthcare. They've managed the pandemic pretty well. They have recently developed their own vaccines. Their longevity is greater than ours. Their infant mortality is lower than ours. What's wrong?
Mhm.
The system creates great medical technology. There's money in that. A healthcare delivery system, not so much. And so you got to learn to think very differently about our problems. Or I'll give you another example right now, Lebanon. On Friday, the entire grid crashed, electrical grid. It's back up this morning, Lebanon time, because the military released some reserve supplies of fuels for 2 major generator plants.
Mhm.
What are they trying to do? Restart the economy they used to have. I doubt they can do it. And what was Lebanon? A great financial center economically. Had very little else going for it. And they have all kinds of political problems. You don't have to read very much to know that they've got people that are at each other all the time, worse than ours. And that's bad. And are they going to come out of it? I have no idea. But if you want a picture of how bad a pretty modern economy can become pretty quickly, Lebanon.
We're kind of in the home stretch here. I'm going to, I think we got lots to talk about. Let me run through the next few slides, and then maybe we can pick up. We learned a lot in this thing, and maybe we've got some answers here. These are all good comments. If I could just kind of, can everybody see the slide now?
No, I turned that off, Pete. So go back to your slides.
Okay, so everybody sees the slides?
No.
I'm seeing the slides.
So you have to go into share screen again.
Yeah, I gotta escape. Let me try this. Is that working?
No.
All right.
You made it look so easy the first time, Pete.
No, just I'm gonna share screen. Share.
Yep, it's working.
Now you
Oh,
got it.
you're seeing you're seeing the screen, but I need to recover my PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. And from the beginning. All right, we should be on.
Yep, it's good.
So now, so you're going to get this very quick. So in summary, by it. So I want to kind of address this block diagram with not just physical infrastructure. Barry was saying that I'm hoping we can regulate our way out of it. And actually what I think is we've kind of identified four major subcomponents. There's a motivational subcomponent, a resource allocation subcomponent, a QC and regulation subcomponent, and an infrastructure component. And I actually think we have to repair all four of those. I think that the financial motivations is completely broken. Not completely, it's broken and needs to be fixed. I think resource allocation is clearly not working at all for the environment. It's not working very well for labor, particularly when we don't know the future of jobs with AI, and it's only partly working for capital. We've covered QC and regulation. We've got regulatory capture. We've got markets. There's no way that healthcare can actually be a free market for people that are facing death and the rest of that. Now on to infrastructure. We could spend more time on this. I'll just point out that our physical infrastructure is aging. We have the Flint water system. The American civil engineers, talk about all the bridges that are ready to collapse. We have the slower and more expensive internet despite developing it ourselves. We need major upgrades to infrastructure in lines with ways that are going to be in a sustainable economy. And the other thing that I'm big on is that I think that we have a cultural infrastructure, trust in institution, the fair dealing, kids growing up, the smartest kids in school used to want to grow up to become engineers and scientists and either to become a Joe DiMaggio or an Einstein. And now they want to go and work for a consulting firm to take companies apart or work for Goldman Sachs to dream up hedge funds. So there's a cultural aspect that enables and supports any economic system. And I think that if you look at your TV, you look at what's on a Facebook, you look at the culture surrounding us, and I think it's toxic. I think it's as toxic as toxic waste on, not throughout. I mean, many of us, whether it's the Micronaut program or First Robotics, you see these incredibly great kids that give you hope for the future, but you also see kids that just want to take shortcuts. And so I think we have work to do in all these areas. Probably lots of questions. We can come back to this. If I were to summarize, I'd say some key points that we learned is one is that capitalism and every other economic system are motivational systems, and they're all imperfect. That capitalism was a set of practices for resource allocation, and I think in this group we've been pretty convinced that it's not sustainable. That several economic sectors have this combination of regulatory capture and customers facing rigged markets. It's not a free market, and those are running out of control. There's no Watt steam governor on them. The evolution of corporate charters, which used to be to build new infrastructures, this was kind of Jim's point, is now using it up. I mean, if you want to make money as a company, find a way to externalize your costs, to capitalize your upside, socialize it when you go bankrupt, leave the pollution in place, etc. And our cultural foundations, they change with every generation. And they've rapidly evolved from the scriptures advocating against interest through feudal times with kings and the Magna Carta to empires exploring our own Gilded Age, the Great Depression and regulation there, World War II riding high. And then this kind of inflection point from 1970 to the present, where we have Friedman, we have the rise of the financial sector and the rest of that, and the problems that we kind of face today. And I would, as we look around and notice that both Republicans and Democrats will not acknowledge this impetus for infinite growth. Both want to borrow now and grow later. Now Trump wants to give the money to the top to trickle down, and Biden wants to give it to the middle. But both are hoping that we grow our GDP to get our way out of this, and that's something we don't think about. We should invest in infrastructure, and it should be infrastructure that's going to serve us well through the next 50 perilous years. We have these rising environmental and climate-related costs, whether it's existential or not. It's going to get too expensive to deal with forest fires every year in the West, and storms taking out ports on the east, and hurricanes, running through agricultural fields. This growth mindset we have is deeply entrenched. It's seen in more ways than you can count. We do have this unknown carrying capacity and the real threat of nonlinear effects. And there's this open question of, if we go back to those four pieces, what kind, if any, will survive? Like Jack, I'm kind of thinking we want to keep free markets where they are, and I think private ownership, particularly at the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy, the house around you, the tools of your production, I think that's a really good invention, and I hope we keep that. So that's kind of the end of it. Questions, thoughts, comments? Barry, maybe unmute us all.
Okay. Yeah. All right. If you have a question, you can just unmute it. There's no unmute all.
Okay.
Words.
So unmute yourself and chime in if you have anything to add.
I can't force people to talk.
Maybe a question to the group. What made the most sense and what made the least sense in our attempt at recapping this? What was completely muddy, and what should we have talked about that we didn't?
I think the one thing is the fundamental assumption that seems to be underlying capitalism is that what people want is, most people want is entirely materialistic. That there's really a much more complex motivation, I think, for most of us than just money or material. And I think that it fails to acknowledge, and it fails to take advantage of that.
I'm absolutely with you.
I also think that that there's come to be a sort of this religious reverence for markets, that they're always going to give the best result, and it's utter nonsense. In some areas, it does a very good job, and I don't know if there's any good way to replace it in distributing, $90 trillion worth of goods and services a year, but there are some things that it does just awfully. And medicine is one of them. There are a number of others. And I think that if we're going to succeed in a capitalist society, we're going to have to return to using it as a tool in the places where it works well, and get it the hell out of the way in the places where it doesn't. And there's much too much that favors the rich and sort of incumbent industries that are well established and have a lot of resources to throw around because they're able to buy representation in Congress and other bodies. It often acts, the regulation often acts against the interests of the society as a whole. And I think it will continue to, as long as people can exert so much influence with money.
Do you want to say something about your sustainability class to this group?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be a class; it's going to be an interest group. But yeah, I want to deal with some of these issues, and we're going to just try to follow some of the interests of the people who are joining the group, as well as my own. But I think there are some fundamental issues about sustainability, and we're bumping up against some of them. And so I'd like to talk about or discuss and explore, what the most salient problems are, what people's concerns are, and then what the hazards are that we're coming closest to, and also what's hopeful and what's likely to allow us to solve problems, in as much as there are such things. And I think there are some hopeful signs that.
Nancy Mead, you've been one of the great contributors to the Capitalism group, and forever finding good books and things like that. What did we miss? What should we have talked about that we forgot to talk about?
Well, I was going to add this. This morning I was reminded, I had that same question in my head. And so this morning I was going back to look at the work of Herman Daly, who left. He's still an emeritus professor. He's in his 80s, and he has 3 prescriptions for how we can make things work. And I thought I will just read them to you, because I think that if we concentrate on certain things, we can still make some amends. And the first one is we can't exceed regenerative capacities. Number 1. Number 2, I have to read this. Waste generation cannot exceed capability to process. And 3, no utilization of non-renewable resources. So there are 3, I think, good maxims for getting along in this world that would help enormously if they were seriously adopted. But in general, I think his concepts have to do with what he calls a steady state economy. And that's what we need to work toward without totally giving up some of the principles of capitalism. That's it.
Did I see Nancy or Joel a question?
Yes. So this is all very depressing. And, we can sit here and just say how terrible things are. And it's possible that in any era, people could have talked about how terrible things are. But I just want to suggest something really positive that we can do that could really make us feel like we're making some kind of a contribution to a good legacy. And that is to join Bill McKibben's new organization called the Third Age. he is trying to, Bill McKibben, the climate activist, is organizing older people, retired people, because he says that the people who have the time and the money and still the health, fortunately, are us, people like us. Young people are always going to be taking the lead because they have freedom, they don't have responsibilities and so forth yet, and they lead every important social movement. But people our age really could contribute if we would somehow organize ourselves together to be climate activists in a meaningful way. So I've joined it. I hope that other people do, because just theorizing about this may be intellectually interesting, but it is not really helping. At least for me, it just makes me depressed if I'm not doing anything. So it's called The Third Age. Bill McKibben, just go to his website.
If I might add, it is a little bit depressing, but to me, this is like just any other machine to be taken apart and fixed. And I think that there are, I mean, the positive for me is that there are some pretty easy fixes for a lot of the problems here. So in the regulation aspect, hidden money is one of the big problems. And Bullock's notion of having the federal government, that anybody wanted to do business with the government had to disclose every contribution they made, hidden money, lobbying, whatever, would go a long way to exposing that. And that could be done with an executive order. And we should be incensed that Biden has not given that executive order. So that's one.
We can't give that. We can't give that executive order. We need something we can do.
Oh, but we can pressure at the political level to do that. So that's a simple thing. That's not like rocket science. On the resource front, just a climate tax. I mean, a carbon tax is the simplest way to establish kind of you don't want to have offsets and stuff like that. You just want to say you take a ton of carbon. Here's the cost, and use that money to build infrastructure. For the future is simply there. I fully agree. I mean, I've just purchased a stack of books on motivation. We need to change motivation. 10 years ago, I had this notion of respectful capitalism. I think that we can change motivational systems to motivate businesses to basically create high quality experiences for customers in a sustainable way. And on the infrastructure thing, we're grandparents. We're there to help our kids, turn off whatever reality TV show you're doing and get out and do something. So anyhow, I think if we break it into these pieces, there are bits we can do in our everyday to help solve this problem and at least help for our kids. Other thoughts? Yeah, Jim.
Well, to add to the depressing scenarios, I think that since the 70s, we've been sliding into an oligarchy rather than a democracy. And I don't know if we're past the tipping point or not, but it really seems like it is. The Republican Party has definitely drunk the Kool-Aid. And so it harkens back a little bit to the Rockefeller and J.P. Morgans and the Vanderbilts that they did some great work for the country. Where they fell down, especially Morgan in the steel industry, was that they exploited their workers to the point of exhaustion and caused basically a revolt of the working class and brought down their whole empires. But the problem now is that the equivalent of the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and Morgans are these invisible black money that is influencing the government so much. I don't know if I sound like a conspiratist or not, but since the Supreme Court made corporations individuals, but they're only individuals in the sense that they can spend money. They aren't individuals in the sense that they can be prosecuted and put in jail. So they're not really individuals like you and me. But anyway, like I'm saying, we all know to different degrees that there's climate change. We all know that there's limited resources. We all know all these things that we're where we're coming to the end of the road. But we aren't going to be able to do anything about those things until we deal with the root cause of why we're sliding in that direction so quickly, until we get control of our government back, and we can then start. The problem is that the foxes are the regulators now, and so we really need to address that situation somehow. And of course, it's by the ballot box, but that's even being attacked. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth.
Jim, if I were to divide that just a little bit more finely, if you look at the true equivalent to the Vanderbilts and stuff we've got, it's the Amazons, the Microsofts, and the Googles, and those people are providing tremendous value to us. And some of them are want to give away their wealth and the rest of that. There's problems with each of them. I mean, you know, and all that, but there's real value. You know, if I didn't have a Zoom and a Google to check resources and a Wikipedia and a Microsoft PowerPoint, I couldn't give this presentation, and we couldn't hear it, and we couldn't talk about how we're going to take back how we're going to have our January 2006 moment somehow more peaceably. Where the hidden money is coming from is two areas. It's finance, it's the hedge fund people and stuff like that, the guys that own Renaissance Tech, and long-term wealth like the Waltons and things like that. So and just divulging that, you know, the hedge fund guys, we know the top 10 wealthy, we don't know the next 50 wealthy because they keep quiet. Same way with where Walton money goes, or where Koch brother money goes, or where Renaissance Tech money goes. So I do think there are pretty simple, pretty effective cures to do the kind of turnaround that we did with trust busting with Roosevelt back when. At least that's my optimistic take.
I think though, that you have to acknowledge that there's a whole lot of opposition to that. Like
absolutely.
Like the carbon tax that you were talking about, the idea has been around for a long time, but it's been effectively opposed, and it has some real drawbacks. For instance, the poor guy who's got some old used car that he's driving around to get to work because he can't afford to live in Santa Cruz, and driving up from Castroville or something, is suddenly going to, if you put a big carbon tax on him, he's going to suddenly have a huge expense in buying gasoline, for instance.
Right.
You can hurt a lot of people by doing that stuff, and there are a lot of constituencies that oppose it, and for as long as the idea has been around, it's been defeated as a political idea.
Well, you could set a bottom limit on something like that, but I think the idea of the disclosure of campaign funds to do business with the government, I think there's a lot of giant companies that are making the military-industrial complex is one of them that would be greatly affected by that type of thing. But I think, you know, Pete's, and it was, I can't remember who it was, the Montana governor?
The Montana governor. To me, it's like very simple, and just as a plus for it. Now we have this sort of flawed proposition where anybody can do a proposition, and various companies, whether it's ambulances or electric or whatever, have tried to use the proposition process to feather their nest. And simply disclosure has California voters, stupid as we are as a collective group, usually get it right in rejecting those. The disclosure is remarkably powerful if we knew who's saying, who opposed a carbon tax, who opposed, you know, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. It does some good.
Oh, maybe we should do that for California as a start.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
All of us old folks can start a new proposition. Okay. Other thoughts, comments? Have we depressed you all? Was this worth doing? It makes me glad I'm not young. That's the first time I've said that. I'm looking for things, you know, as we get older, it usually ends in some bad thing. And so as we get older, we won't have to worry about this. Yeah, unfortunately, all my grandchildren are going to be paying the bills. Yeah, there you go. All righty. I think we're done. Thank you much. Well, thank you, Pete. Thank you very much. That was a very worthwhile time. Cheers.
Thank you.
Gary, want to stay on for a second?
Okay. Okay.
So what do you think? What pluses and minuses?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a neutral observer, so but we pretty much stuck to our time anyway. Okay.
I see Jack, you're still there. I know you might have had some points you wanted to get in.
Uh, Not in addition to what I said before, I think population is a major driver in all of this. And with low fertility rates, it should, at some point, growth of population should taper off.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Maybe become a steady state.
Yeah.
And if that,
But the key,
then the force for growth will recede some. And that's like I'm given to understand that at about 10 or 11 billion, this is a point where the inflection is, and then it'll be much easier to deal with the things if it's possible this even supply food for that many people. Was a wonderful lecture about this by one of our faculty members, whose name, he must be in your department, plant biology. He gave a wonderful lecture on whether there would be food supply.
you're thinking about Lake and Tays. Yeah.
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 There are these problems, but I think you want to rely on the price system and the market mechanisms and property and proper regulation. Running it like the Army did, or like I can remember World War II. I don't want to live under such a regime.
Very much. I got a note asking to share the video with a couple sons. So I think maybe we want to clip the front and the end and maybe make it available.
Yeah. Okay. I can do that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Another, I'm going to sign off here, but we might have another couple questions or comments. Or this is Barry and I committed to do this before we knew we could do it, and it's a first draft. And so any help to make a better second draft, if there ever is a second draft, might be useful. Any suggestions or thoughts? Rusty, this is your chance.
Right. Okay.
Oh, unmute yourself. Rusty has something to say.
I'm speechless.
This is a problem. In the future, whatever future economic system we have, our smartest and brightest people are not allowed to be speechless.
Right.
I'm not one of the most knowledgeable about economics. I'm afraid, Pete, we would have to break this into multiple segments for me.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there was an awful lot in there anyway. Yeah, but yeah, no, it was quite interesting. Yes, no, I enjoyed it.
Right.
Okay.
I want to say just one thing to Jack. My issue partly is, let's say the population is cut in half and we've only got 4 billion people. Won't those people who are making $1,000 a year or $2,000 a year want to make $40,000 a year? It doesn't matter if we cut the population in half. If they go from 2,000 to 10,000, the total resource consumption will be double what it is today. So population will help, but it doesn't address the core issue.
Well, maybe
I'm not saying it does, but in all this talk about growth, I think population growth is a very strong driver. We haven't talked about that.
Well, my point is, if we population is starting to go down, but growth won't go down under our current system.
Well,
There are just too many people with too many needs.
Well, another way to look at Jack's thing is that because economists want growth to keep the economy growing,
Yeah,
they want population growth. So we have not exactly learned what a US with zero population growth is going to look like economically. So that's another question that opens up there.
yeah.
Just to answer, we decided specifically not to cover population, even though we know it's a driver a lot of this, in part because I think at the beginning of the capitalism curve, we were kind of on Club of Rome, infinite population growth. That's not going to work. And then we saw so many reports of population growth kind of naturally tapering off in first world countries